Hush, little baby, don't you cry. It is just a lullaby. Dreams of rainbows make you stop. And I am here to wake you up!
Okay, welcome into the program. We're glad you're here. Talk Radio 1210 WPHT. It's Dick Mars, Gary Arnell. Hey, we're going to give you a side of the Ebola story that is not being reported by the mainstream media. That seems like what we do a lot. That's our modus operandi here on this program. Paul Joseph Watson is on our newsmaker line. He's the editor of Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.com. And he says in an apparent attempt to avoid hysteria, U.S. health authorities are withholding details about a number of suspected Ebola victims from the public. And we welcome you, Paul Joseph Watson, Dick Morris, and Gary Arnell.
Hey, Paul.
Hi, good to be here.
Hi, this is Dick Morris. How are you doing?
Hi, good to be on the air today.
Good. Nice to be with you. So you say that there are, at last count, 6 potential Ebola cases at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York that we're not really being told about.
Yeah, there's actually 7. The latest information says 7. And not all of them, the CDC has since disclosed are at the Mount Sinai Hospital. In fact, only 1 case is being treated there. The other 6 are in different areas of the country. So what's interesting is that the CDC told Time magazine yesterday that they were receiving dozens of calls from hospitals and state authorities from across the country, warning that they're taking in patients who recently returned from West Africa with Ebola-like symptoms. So we've got numerous alerts being sent out by these hospitals. It appears that the CDC is trying to keep it under wraps to a certain extent because CNN's Dr. Sanjay Gupta went on the air yesterday and basically said, quote, their stories were not being made public, these 6 other cases that we're talking about. So there's definitely an attempt, whether you agree with it or not, on behalf of the CDC and other health authorities to try and keep a lot of what's happening under wraps.
One of the things that got my attention is that there is apparently a real disagreement between CDC in Atlanta, Center for Disease Control, and the Canadian health authorities on the question of whether Ebola can be spread by air. Which obviously is key in terms of its capacity to be a serious epidemic. U.S. says no. Canada says it's very likely that it can be spread by air. Hasn't been completely proven, but remains a real likelihood.
That's right. There was a study in 2012 by Canadian scientists who found that, at least to a limited degree, Ebola, this new strain of it, had gone airborne because they put monkeys and pigs in a pen separated by a barbed wire fence, so no actual physical contact. And most of the monkeys in that experiment got the Ebola virus. They inhaled it, got the respiratory syndromes, and died. So they concluded that it was airborne to a limited extent. And as you mentioned, Canada's top public health agency then said, I think the quote was, that it's strongly suspected that Ebola has gone airborne. Another question related to that is, why are these health workers, including the American experts, who know what precautions to take when dealing with Ebola patients, why are they becoming infected if they're supposedly, they have all the protective gear? There needs to be, obviously, a transmission of bodily fluids, but they're all becoming infected as well. So the question is, has Ebola gone airborne? That's the major threat.
And of course, we don't really understand the nature of the disease. The death rate estimates I've seen range from a low of 50 to a high of 90, and which is a hell of a range. I gather in Nigeria and Sierra Leone, half of those infected have died, but we don't know how many more will.
At the moment, yeah, it's 50 to 60%. Beforehand, it was closer to 90. The interesting thing about it is, obviously, there's been a lot of criticism over why these 2 patients were brought into Atlanta. For example, Dr. Bob Arnott, who is an infectious disease specialist, said, quote, "There is no medical reason to bring them here, especially when you see how well Dr. Bradley was." So the argument is that they could have been treated in Africa with basically the same drug. Why are they being brought back into the U.S., which could pose a threat if the disease has gone airborne? Because if, you know, a lot of these hospitals simply don't have the facilities to properly isolate patients. 75,000 people a year die from hospital infections alone. So can we really trust the proficiency of these hospitals to deal with a wider Ebola outbreak if it becomes more serious and if it becomes apparent that this new strain is in fact airborne?
Now, there was an experimental drug that was developed, I think, to treat the monkeys you talked about, that was given to the doctor who, what is his name, Dr. Bentley, I think, or
Dr. Bradley. Yeah.
Bradley, yeah. And he was given that drug, and he has recovered. And I read an ethicist saying that it was a mistake to give him the drug, first of all, because it could have killed him, because we don't know that it doesn't. But more importantly, she said it interferes with the FDA process, which can take years to establish positively the dosage and effect of each drug. Well, that's fine, but we don't necessarily have a couple of years here.
Well, I mean, the FDA actually blocked a drug. They delayed a drug from coming out a few months ago, which was very successful in trials in curing Ebola. What's interesting is that people like Dr. Ben Newman, who went on Bloomberg, said, quote, "There's not enough panic to justify a cure." So in other words, there's not enough money in it for the pharmaceutical industry to really get behind and push either a vaccine or a drug, which is interesting if you compare that to the 2009 swine flu outbreak, which of course was backed by huge hysteria. There were reports of, you know, troops on the streets, riots, tens of thousands of people dead if this went widespread in the West. And that's most likely because the pharmaceutical companies already had the vaccine lined up. And then, according to people like Wolfgang Wodog, head of the Health Council of Europe, they put pressure on the WHO to declare a global pandemic. They put pressure on Western governments to buy this vaccine, which turned out, in his words, to be, quote, a profit-making hoax. So it's interesting to compare the two in terms of hysteria. Back then, they had the vaccine ready to roll. We saw doomsday headlines about this. Now, the vaccine, the drugs are in the very early stages, and we don't see anything like the same level of hysteria.
Paul Joseph Watson, editor of Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.com, Talk Radio 1210 WPHT. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Paul Joseph Watson, there's a 2-day emergency meeting taking place now by the UN where they could recommend actions to prevent the spread. More than 930 people have died in 4 countries since the outbreak in March. What do you think the summation is going to be of this 2-day UN gathering? What are we going to hear, Paul Joseph Watson, from this?
Well, the main point they're deliberating is if they're going to declare a global health emergency. And if that happens, then obviously you will see the preparation for it ramped up. You will see more people being tested who come through airports. There are some airlines that have blocked flights going to Africa. Most U.S. airlines, I don't think any have blocked them so far. So you're going to see a lot more people being screened for respiratory illnesses as they come into America and other Western countries, which is kind of scary, you know, because Obama back on July 31st signed an amendment to an executive order which said that anyone with any kind of respiratory illness, apart from influenza...
Or symptom.
Or symptom.
The previous executive order was about SARS, and it was signed by Bush in 2003.
Right,
and it said
Obama replaced the SARS with this vague term respiratory illness,
well,
that anybody could be detained. So
the big demarcation was that Bush required that you find that the person had SARS.
Exactly.
Obama requires simply that you exhibit flu-like symptoms.
Exactly. So they're really cranking that up. And then you've got the CDC on top of that. Their own guidelines state that, quote, well persons who, quote, do not show symptoms of a communicable disease can be quarantined, can be detained. So people are rightly concerned about medical martial law. Whether it happens in this case, it may not. But for future examples of outbreaks, they've really cranked up that medical martial law via the executive order.
That's fascinating. I read the story, in fact, reported on it. But the idea of medical martial law is kind of an interesting one. So now, is there any reason to be concerned about our porous southern border, particularly of children coming over from Central America and Mexico in light of Ebola, or is that just hysteria?
Well, there was a leaked Customs and Border Protection document which came out, I believe, on Monday. Basically underlined the fact that thousands of immigrants from these Ebola-hit nations have attempted to sneak across the U.S. border this year. They were apprehended, obviously.
From West Africa?
From Ebola-hit nations, yeah, and then they came across the southern border. So they had entered Mexico or Central America initially from these West African countries, then attempted to sneak across the border.
Okay.
So that there are concerns that those who weren't apprehended by border authorities could pose a health risk. That there's no evidence of that at the moment, but it was a concern after the release of these border protection documents.
And they did, in the documents, say specifically that they had apprehended several immigrants trying to cross in illegally who came from one of those four nations that has Ebola breakouts.
Yeah, I believe it was up to 1,000 immigrants from these nations originally that they had apprehended since the beginning of the year. So obviously that's another concern.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, thank you very much, sir. I appreciate it. It's Paul Joseph Watson, I'm sorry.
Yep.
And he writes, he is the editor of Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.com. Can we find your stuff there?
Yeah, all my articles are on there. Twitter.com/PrisonPlanet as well is the Twitter account.
Twitter, right. Okay, good. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming on, Mr. Watson.
Okay, my pleasure. Take care.
Thank you, sir. You know, Dick, interesting, the Canadian scientist.
So get this, everybody. The guy developing the experimental Ebola treatment has joked about culling humanity. It doesn't get much creepier than this.
Yeah, this is really creepy. This is Dr. Charles Arntzen of Arizona State University. He's the guy who's behind growing vaccines and tobacco plants for DARPA. He's also the guy behind the experimental treatment that was given to the Ebola-infected Americans they flew in. And he's also this guy that we reported on back in July 2013, joking about culling large swaths of the population with a genetically engineered virus.
And he's one of these elite scientists in the cutting edge of bioengineering who are using it to develop things like edible vaccines. He was going to create a banana vaccine to give to the third world. He had a bunch of Rockefeller Foundation funding and so forth that would have medicine grown into the plant or the fruit. And you can use basically any medicine.
And speaking of growing things into plants, he's also worked with Dr. Mitch Hein of Epicite. Not sure if you guys remember Epicite, but they were really popular back in the early 2000s because they were growing pharmacorn, genetically engineered corn, with anti-sperm antibodies in it.
And of course, he's also worked for DARPA. One of the things he did is work on stockpiling an anthrax vaccine or an anthrax treatment for the military. But his words at this lecture here are just sick. It's incredible what he said. Listen to his response about should we feed the world when there's 8 billion people?
And should we concern ourselves with feeding 8+ billion in the first place, or should we allow natural forces of carrying capacity to affect
Should we let disease, war, and pestilence wipe people out?
Aside, says that question. So, thoughts on this?
Has anybody seen Contagion? That's the answer. Go out and use genetic engineering to create a better virus. 25% of the world population is supposed to go in Contagion.
Science doesn't let us read the
That's so funny, isn't it?
Oh, and so he's literally ripping the plot from a Hollywood thing where they use martial law in the wake of a huge epidemic. Either way, this guy is working on the treatments for Ebola.
I mean, this is the last person on the face of the planet that you want joking about creating a genetically engineered virus to wipe out large amounts of people. The guy who's now working on the new fast-tracked through the FDA Ebola treatment to treat the Ebola virus, we've shown you before in our reports, is being caused by the Ebola version that our CDC has a patent for.
Yeah, trust that guy.
Trust him.
Has anybody seen Contagion? That's the answer. Go out and use genetic engineering to create a better virus.